These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Now a defensive use of our current idea, and in a horizontal setting. Black is ahead a piece. He has to address White's threats against his knight and bishop. How? With a fence, Black has a bishop on the 8th rank and can move his queen behind it with queen moves to d8. That move creates the kernel of a discovered attack against White's queen. To make the threat really interesting, the bishop would need somewhere good to go. Can it reach White's king? Not quite. It can move to a6, though, at which point it is aimed at the threatened knight. Now the defensive idea comes together. If Black plays queen moves to d8 and White then plays king takes knight, as he now threatens to do, Black would be able to win the queen with bishop moves to a6, check. Odd as it may seem, by moving his queen to d8 Black thus defends his knight on e2, he creates a discovered attack that will be unleashed if his knight is taken. Black to move. What is the best move? Again White's king can take Black's knight on e2. Black has a bigger problem, too, for White threatens to mate by playing queen moves to f7, check. Forcing Black's king to h8 and then mating on f8, his queen goes there and gets taken by Black's rook, then White has rook takes rook, checkmate. Yet Black can address both problems with the ingenious queen moves to e8. See what this does. Now Black's queen is on the e-file, ready to defend the knight once his bishop on e5 has moved out of the way. In other words, the kernel of a discovery has been created expressly to protect a fellow piece at the other end of it. Indeed, this does better than protect the knight and defend f7 against mate. It means that if White plays king takes knight, Black then has a discovered check with bishop moves to b8, check. Attacking White's queen as well as his king. We aren't finished. Don't forget to consider what White would do about the check you are imagining when Black moves his bishop out of the way. White could interpose his rook with rook moves to e3, not only blocking the check but attacking Black's queen. So then what? Black looks for another check that would then be possible. So long as he keeps White busy with checks, the capture bishop takes queen will still be waiting for him afterwards. Here Black's next check is queen moves to b5, check. White again can interpose the rook, but this time it only blocks the check. It can pose no threat against a queen attacking along a diagonal. Now it's safe for Black's bishop to take White's queen. White to move. What is the best move? You might start this one by observing that White's f5 bishop can give check with bishop takes at h7. By itself this doesn't achieve anything, but it's something to know as you think through your options. Okay, now look at your other forcing moves, your possible captures and what they do. There is one. Knight takes knight, inviting black to retake with queen takes knight. The interesting thing about this exchange is that it puts black's queen on a line with the white bishop, which we know can give check. Maybe now you begin thinking about slipping white's queen onto h5 to create the structure of a discovered attack on the 5th rank. You wonder how you might do it in a violent manner that forces black's reply and keeps the discovery intact. Or maybe you just keep looking for other captures you can make. Either way you come to inspect 2. Bishop takes at g7. Black has to reply bishop takes bishop or else lose the rook on f8. But after black plays bishop takes bishop, the way is clear for white to play 3. Queen moves to h5, threatening mate with queen takes at h7. The mate threat is easy for black to defang, of course, with pawn from h7 moves to h6, but it serves its purpose. White gets his queen onto line with his bishop and with black's queen, and black has had no time to fend off the discovered attack that now has been set up on the 5th rank. White pulls the trigger with 4. Bishop moves to h7, check. Requiring black to play king takes bishop and unmasking 5. Queen takes queen. White wins black's queen and pawn in return for his 2 bishops. White to move. What is the best move? Rook discoveries. Introduction, simple cases. We turn now to a different pattern, the rook that blocks and then unmasks an attack along a diagonal by a bishop or queen. In a way the pattern is the reverse of a bishop discovery. This time the unmasker moves vertically or horizontally while the attacker runs on a diagonal. Since the mechanics involved are familiar, we won't spend quite as much time on the rook as we did on the bishop or as we will on the knight. Still, there are some differences between the patterns that are worth a few moments of special attention and visual absorption. First, an unmasking rook usually has a harder time giving check than an unmasking bishop does. The bishop can act as a dive bomber, coming in on a diagonal to attack the king from above or below. The rook has to deliver check by moving straight down onto the king's rank, or, less often, over onto the king's file. Either of these moves can unmask an attack, as we shall see, but they are less common than the bishop's strike against, say, h7. The significance of this is that when the rook discovers an attack, the distraction it creates more often is not a check but instead is some sort of mating threat, typically against the back rank. And discovered checks, i.e., moves where the piece behind the rook gives the check, rather than the rook itself also make up a relatively large share of rook discoveries. Finally, discoveries by the rook also look different than discoveries by the bishop. The rook kernel isn't as easy for the untrained eye to see as the bishop kernel. The eye is accustomed to looking up and down the files but not so accustomed to scanning the diagonals in the same way. The positions in this chapter are meant to build that visual habit. Let's begin with positions that are comparable to the first studies in the chapter on bishop discoveries. There, a bishop masked a queen or rook that was ready to attack an enemy piece along a file. Here, a rook masks a bishop or queen that is prepared to attack an enemy piece along a diagonal. There, the bishop unmasked the attacking piece with a diagonal move that checked the enemy king. Here, the rook unmasks the attacker with a vertical move, a move down a file that checks the enemy king. In either case, the unmasked piece has time to make its capture after the check is fended off. Where does white have the makings of a discovered attack in this first example to the left? The answer presents a new pattern. It's on the diagonal pawn from f1 moves to h3, where the rook masks an attack by the bishop against black's queen. The questions about the idea's execution are familiar. What violent move can the rook make that will require a time-consuming response from black, giving the bishop time to take black's queen? The answer, of course, is a check. Rook takes at g7, check. Requires black to play king takes rook, or move his king, and now white plays bishop takes queen. White to move. What is the best move? Where does white have the makings of a discovered attack? This position is similar to the last one and is offered mostly for the sake of pattern reinforcement. They differ in trivial respects. The white pieces comprising the kernel of the discovery are another square apart, and this time it's the queen rather than the bishop that is unmasked. But the execution is about the same. Black's queen starts out as a bad target because it has protection from the knight on g7. White can eliminate the guard while unmasking the queen and can do it with check. Rook takes knight, check. After king takes rook, white plays queen takes queen and wins a queen and a knight for a rook. White to move. What is the best move? The general idea here is the same as before. See the queen behind rook pattern for white, this time running in the other direction. Notice the black queen, poised to be taken by white's queen if the rook can move out of the way with check. Here the rook's check probably is of its most common type, the move to the back rank, in this case with rook moves to e8, check. The check easily is defused with rook takes rook, but then white wins the queen with queen takes queen. Black to move. What is the best move? Where does black have the makings of a discovered attack? There is nothing on the files or ranks, but along the pawn from g1 moves to a7 diagonal black has a bishop masked by a rook. Does the bishop have a suitable target if the rook moves? Yes, in white's unprotected knight. As discussed in more detail in our work on forks, an unprotected or loose piece always calls for a look at whether it can be taken with a tactical maneuver. Here the question is whether black can vacate his rook from c5 in a manner that is time-consuming enough to allow him to take the knight a move later and that doesn't lose the rook. Since the payoff of the discovery is just going to be a knight, black can't afford to sacrifice his rook the way he did in the previous positions. So black looks for safe rook checks and finds rook moves to c1, check. Where the rook is covered by black's bishop at e3. The move forces the king to move to a2 and then allows black to play bishop takes knight safely. White to move. What is the best move? Threatening mate. In the positions just seen, the attacking player used his rook to give check. The opponent's need to defend against the check gave the piece that had been uncovered by the rook time to win material on the next move. Sometimes the rook can achieve much the same effect by threatening mate, as this puts the enemy under pressure similar to that created by a check. A rook most commonly can threaten mate by offering to drop onto the back rank when the enemy king is trapped there. This theme is worth our independent attention for two reasons. First, seeing a mate threat often is harder than seeing a check, it takes some practice. Second, when you work with mate threats you have to be especially careful to consider what trouble your opponent can make in reply. Since by assumption you haven't put him in check, you may have left him with latitude to respond with checks of his own that seize the initiative. In the current position white has the kernel of a discovered attack along the pawn from g1 moves to a7 diagonal, where his rook masks his queen which otherwise would be able to take black's queen. Now think about execution, what large threat can white create with the rook? Rook takes at f6 is its only capture, but the move is more than that, it aims the rook at f8, where it would mate the trapped black king with rook takes rook, checkmate. So in reply to 1. Rook takes at f6 black has to capture white's rook, pawn from g7 takes rook, which of course creates time for white to play queen takes queen on his next move. Now notice that if it were black's turn to move he would have queen moves to a1, check. White would be forced to reply king takes queen after which black has the knight fork knight takes bishop, winning a piece. This should worry you a little for the reason sketched a couple of paragraphs above. The first move in white's planned sequence, rook takes at f6, is a capture and mate threat, but not a check, so you have to consider whether he can give checks of his own that will derail your plans. In this case black could respond to rook takes at f6 with 2 consecutive checks, as just discussed, queen moves to a1, check. And then knight takes bishop, check. Forcing white to move his king. So are white's plans foiled? No, for then black is out of checks that hold the initiative. The next move he wants to play is knight takes queen, but he can't afford it because black mates with rook takes rook. White thus holds onto the queen. White to move. What is the best move? A similar idea. First find where white has the makings of a discovered attack. The kernel lies on the long pawn from a1 moves to h8 diagonal, where white's rook masks his queen in familiar fashion. Look for a target for the queen once it's unmasked and see that black's queen is in the line of fire and that it's loose. The challenge now is straightforward: vacate the rook from d4 in a way that compels a response from black. The rook has no checks, so examine the black king's position for vulnerabilities. It is trapped on the back rank, although it isn't entirely sealed in by its pawns. White's bishop closes off the flight square on g7. The same idea we saw in the previous position thus works here. An attack by white's rook against black's rook on e8 would be a mating threat, because if white can play rook takes rook the game ends. White makes the threat with rook moves to e4. Black has to eliminate white's rook to stay in the game. He has 2 ways to do it. The first is bishop takes rook, to which white replies queen takes queen and mates soon. Black also has the option of replying to rook moves to e4 with rook takes rook. How should white reply? This time the answer for white isn't quite queen takes queen, since black then uses his rook to mate on e1. White instead needs to work with checks to prevent that possibility. By moving his rook off the back rank, black has made this easy. White plays queen moves to c8, check. Which requires black to interpose his queen on d8. White takes it, queen takes queen, check, then we go through the same process with black's rook, then it's mate. Black's best reply to 1. Rook moves to e4 is probably 1. Black queen moves to e5, which avoids the mate just shown but loses his queen and then his bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? Another variation on the same idea, this time from black's side. Where does black have the makings of a discovered attack? On the long pawn from a8 moves to h1 diagonal. As usual the rook masks the queen, and if it were moved black could play queen takes queen. The important question involves what to do with the rook. Again it has no checks, so consider the white king and its vulnerabilities. Here as in the previous position it is stuck on the back rank, as black's bishop on h3 cuts off its escape. And once more the king has a single guard, the rook on e1. If black threatens that rook with his own, he threatens mate. So he has two possibilities, either of which works. 1. Rook moves to d1 or 1. Rook moves to e5. There is a little more to say, because you always must ask whether your opponent has a way to both move the targeted piece out of danger and spoil the mating threat. White's queen can't move to the east because black then threatens to mate with queen moves to g2. But in response to either of those rook moves we have sketched, white can play 2. Queen takes at h3, avoiding queen takes queen and preparing to interpose the queen on f1 if black plays rook takes rook. But then he still loses the queen and also both rooks. It goes to rook takes rook, check. 3. Queen moves to f1, rook takes queen, check. 4. King takes rook, queen takes rook h1 plus. Black has a queen left and white has nothing. Black to move. What is the best move? Observe the offensive tension on the board. Black would like to use his queen to take white's rook on f5, but then he would lose his own rook to white's queen. How to break the jam? By use of the queen-rook-queen alignment on the pawn from e1 moves to a5 diagonal, the three-piece kernel of a discovery. White's queen is ready to be taken if the rook can vacate c3 with sufficient violence. The rook has no way to give check, but study white's king, it's trapped on the back rank. If black could land a rook there he might have a mate threat except for the protection furnished by white's rook on b1, if black could take that rook with his own, he would indeed threaten mate. So the threat by black of rook takes rook is almost as good as a check, and black can achieve this with 1. Black rook moves to b3. What next? White is confronted with multiple threats, so he might naturally look for a way to defuse them both, a square where his queen would be safe and would defend against rook takes rook, checkmate. One possibility is 2. Queen moves to c1. This takes care of those two problems, but not a third one. Black now can play queen takes rook with no worries, because white's queen no longer is in position to retaliate by taking the rook on c3. But before playing queen takes rook black has to exchange rooks on b1, otherwise white meets black's queen takes rook with pawn from c2 takes rook. White is left with a queen against black's bishop and queen. A better reply idea for white would be 2. Pawn from a2 takes rook b3. Black then plays queen takes queen next move, so this time white has lost a queen for a rook, but at least he ends up with 2 rooks against black's queen and bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? First note the kernel of a discovered attack spread along the long pawn from h1 moves to a8 diagonal. If unmasked, the black bishop could take white's queen. Can the rook be vacated from f3 with check? Yes, black can play rook moves to f1, check. And white would have to reply rook takes rook, his queen would then be pinned. Then black could play bishop takes queen, to which white replies king takes bishop, and black has won a queen for a bishop and a rook. Don't settle for this, though, think through all of your options. How else could the rook vacate f3, and with what results? He could threaten mate with rook takes knight, looking to play rook takes rook, checkmate. Next move. Rook takes knight therefore has about the same effect as a check but picks up a knight along the way. Now what would white do? Stay aware of every piece bearing on the enemy king's position. Here black has a second rook he can involve, this one on the open e-file. So if white replies to rook takes knight with rook takes rook d3, black plays his other rook to e1 and its mate. White instead needs to create a flight square for his king, and therefore replies to rook takes knight with queen takes bishop. It avoids checkmate but loses the queen. The key thing for black now is not to play the tempting rook takes queen a8, but to instead use rook takes rook, check. It wins a rook, and since it's a check it effectively is a free move. White has to spend his reply saving his king, and so can't move his queen out of harm's way on the 8th rank. When black has finished giving checks and doing whatever damage he can in the process, white's queen still will be on a8 for the taking. Capturing the rook on d1 first with check, then taking black's queen later, is an example of using the priority of check, the principle that a check must be addressed before any other threat pending on the board. It is a valuable idea that we will revisit often and study in detail later. Black to move. What is the best move? By now the queen and rook kernel for black on the long diagonal no doubt is obvious. Look for a target for the queen if unmasked, and see that white's queen is loose and ready to be taken on c3. Black just needs a threat to make with his rook on e5. The rook can't directly threaten anything at the moment, but the key fact about the piece is that it is part of a battery of rooks aimed at white's back rank. Play through the first rook capture in your mind's eye. One black rook takes rook, check. To which white replies to rook takes rook. Now what? The answer is tricky. Are you inclined to play to black rook takes rook, check? Checking the king? Not so fast. White's queen protects e1, so white would be able to play 3. Queen takes rook, taking the queen out of danger and dissolving the check at the same time. Any other ideas? Consider the surprising 2. Black rook moves to e2, which puts pressure on a square next to white's king, f2, that black already attacks with his queen. This allows black to threaten mate with 3. Black queen takes at f2, white must do something to prevent it. If he plays 3. Queen takes queen, black doesn't recapture right away with pawn from g7 takes queen, rather, he first plays rook takes rook, check. Winning a rook and checking white's king, the priority of check again. After the king moves to h2, then black still has pawn from g7 takes queen and only black's rook is left on the board. If white instead plays something other than queen takes queen on the second move of the sequence, black plays queen takes queen on his next move. The hard part of this position is seeing the value of rook moves to e2 for black. The key point to remember is the sensitivity of squares next to the king, especially when they already are attacked by a queen. Adding another attacker against such squares, as black does here with his second rook, can create a crushing threat even if no check or capture is made with the move. Black to move. What is the best move? The rook discovers check. We turn to the power of the rook to discover check. The position on the left illustrates the pattern in simple form. Scan the diagonals and you see black's queen behind his rook, with white's king at the other end of the line. The stage is set for a discovered check, black just needs a good target for his rook. Best would be either white's queen, because it's more valuable than the rook, or any unprotected white piece, because then it doesn't matter whether the rook is more valuable. White's queen can be attacked with rook moves to c4, check. After white protects his king, king moves to h1 is best, black plays rook takes queen. It would be different if white could take his queen someplace where it had protection and block the check, but there is no such square. If white plays queen moves to e3, for example, black has queen takes queen, check. This renews the check and thus gives black time to save his rook on his next move. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is another way it can go. Black's rook masks his bishop, which otherwise would have an open line to white's king. What should black do with his rook? The queens are off the board, so black looks for pieces he might attack. There are two, white's knight and rook. Which is the better target? The knight, because it is unprotected. If black plays rook moves to b2, check. And then rook takes rook, he just ends up exchanging rooks after knight takes rook. The winning move thus is rook moves to a2, check. Or rook moves to f3, check, followed by rook takes knight after white saves his king. White to move. What is the best move? White's rook masks the path of his bishop toward black's king, so white's task is to find a destructive role for the rook. Again the queens are off the board, and again white is picking between attacks against black's rook, with rook moves to e6, check, and a lesser piece, with rook takes at b6, check, attacking the bishop. Both targets are unguarded at the moment, but black can reply to the check with king moves to f7, protecting the rook. So rook takes at b6, check. Is better, it wins a pawn and a bishop for nothing. White to move. What is the best move? It starts with identification of an idea, the kernel of a discovered attack. Here you find white's rook blocking a check by his queen. The only question is where the rook should go. It will have two moves to inflict damage, and unlike the bishop it can reach squares of either color. Naturally white would like to go after black's queen, and he can. But another critical feature of the rook's powers is that it can move both horizontally or vertically, so there still is a decision to make. White can attack black's queen with rook moves to c5, check. Or rook moves to d6, check. Choose carefully. Your chief worry in executing a discovered check is that the targeted piece here, the queen, will be able to move out of harm's way in a manner that also blocks the check. So start by considering rook moves to d6, check. And ask whether black's queen would have any such moves. It would. Queen moves to c4 would block the check and also lend the queen protection against queen takes queen from the pawn on b5. Now try the other move, rook moves to c5, check. This time the only way black's queen could block the check is by moving to d5 or e6, but on those squares it gets no protection and so is lost to pawn from e4 takes queen or queen takes queen. Rook moves to c5, check. Thus is the winning move for white. White to move. What is the best move? White has a tempting attack against black's back rank. Black's king is trapped in the corner, and white's queen is poised to move to c8. Should it? The crucial thing to recognize here is that the kernel of a discovery lies on the board for black. His rook masks his bishop, which will check white's king as soon as the rook vacates f2. This is the dominant tactical fact of this position, and it makes queen moves to c8, check. A disaster for white, for then black plays rook moves to f8, check. Not only blocking white's check, but winning his queen with rook takes queen as soon as white takes his own king out of check. White had better play king moves to h1 instead. Black to move. What is the best move? Now a reminder that a discovered mate threat can be formidable, too. The alignment of pieces on the pawn from d1 moves to h5 diagonal cries out for consideration of a discovered attack. If black moves his rook from e2, his queen will threaten not only to take white's rook on d1 but to mate there almost. White's queen presently guards the square. The question for black is the best use he might make of his rook as it unmasks the threat, and the natural answer is to go after the white queen that protects the rook. He experiments with rook moves to b2. If white plays the capture queen takes rook, black mates as just noted. Nor can white move his queen to any other square where it will prevent mate. The best he can do is queen takes at d5, taking a pawn and guarding against immediate mate by protecting the d1 square. But then black takes the queen with his c6 pawn, or with his own queen, it doesn't matter, and white has nothing left but rook moves to f1. Black is ahead by a queen and has a 1 game. The discovered attack here seemed at first to be foiled by white's queen, which appeared to guard the targeted piece. Consider in such a case whether the discovered attack might be turned against the very piece that seems to frustrate it. White to move. What is the best move? This position is not an especially good fit for the current section because it does not involve a discovery in the usual sense, but it goes here as well as any place. White has to do something about black's threat of bishop takes rook. He looks at any captures he can make and considers their consequences, what lines they would open and so forth. There is just one, bishop takes bishop, resulting in rook takes bishop. The interesting feature of this exchange is that it not only extinguishes the threat against white's a1 rook but also leaves that rook and white's king with nothing between them and an enemy target on b2. White therefore can devastate black by castling, 0-0-0. Suddenly black's king has been checked by white's rook, while black's rook is about to be taken for free by white's king. Castling into an attack is not something you have a chance to do very often, but when the opportunity arises it is memorable. Black to move. What is the best move? Manufacturing discovered check. Now let's look at a few positions where some element of the discovered check open lines or appropriate targets has to be manufactured. The ideas behind the methods used here will be familiar, only the context is any different from what has come before, but seeing how the old ideas look in new settings will make them easier to see in real time. Find the makings of a discovered attack for black in the position to the left. His rook blocks his bishop along the pawn from g1 moves to a 7 diagonal. The bishop is aimed toward white's king but is blocked by the pawn at f2. Black can't capture the pawn and cause an interesting recapture, so try another idea, capturing something the pawn protects and thus forcing it to move on the recapture. Viz. Black plays queen takes bishop, inviting pawn from f2 takes queen. If white plays the recapture, black's discovered check has been nicely prepared. All that remains is to find a good target the d4 rook can reach in 2 moves. Rook moves to d8, check. Unmasks check, then after white saves his king, black has rook takes queen. Take a moment now to appreciate the threats that black faces in this position and how the sequence just described would bear on them. White has 3 pieces aimed near black's king, his queen, rook, and bishop. Look at white's checks and you see that he is poised to play rook takes at c7, check. Black would have to play bishop takes rook. Now comes the follow-up check queen takes bishop, check. Forcing black's king onto a8, and finally white mates with queen moves to b8. Fortunately it's not white's turn to move. The beauty of queen takes bishop for black is not only that it wins a piece by threatening a discovered check, it also defuses white's threat against c7 by adding a guard to the square, black's queen, and by taking out one of the attackers against it, white's bishop. White to move. What is the best move? First find the kernel of a discovery. You are trying to learn to see them every time, even when they don't appear to lead any place. White's rook masks the path of his bishop toward black's bishop and, behind it, his king. If black's bishop could be replaced with his king, white would have the makings of a discovered check. Capturing the bishop would be one way to achieve this, but again white has no way to do it, and yet again, too, there is the alternative of capturing something the bishop protects the knight on h5. White can take it with queen takes knight, check. If black recaptures bishop takes queen, the bishop is out of the way and white can unmask a check by moving his rook. He looks for damage the rook can inflict with 2 moves and sees that black's queen is within reach. Rook moves to d6, check. Attacks it, rook takes queen takes it after black saves his king. White wins a piece. Well, but wait, how does black save his king? He can move it, say, to g7, but he also can save it with a threat by playing his bishop from h5 back to g6, where it blocks the check and also throws a counter-attack at white's bishop. Now after white plays rook takes queen, black can play bishop takes bishop. This would mean white traded away a queen and a bishop to win a queen and a knight, but we aren't quite done yet. After black's bishop takes bishop, white recaptures with knight takes bishop and still wins a piece. So the modest-looking knight on e1 is necessary to make the whole sequence work. If that knight were off the board, the sequence just described still would be worth a pawn, though, after black plays bishop takes bishop, white would have rook moves to b5, forking the loose pawns on a5 and c5. The lesson of this last note is to take time to consider how your opponent will reply to the checks you make. If it's clear that he will have to move his king, it may not matter too much where it goes, though then again it might. But if he has interpositions, you need to anticipate what they would make possible for him on offense. Black to move. What is the best move? Black's rook masks his bishop on the long pawn from h1 moves to a8 diagonal. The question is whether the king can be drawn into the line of fire. The usual way to so move a king by checking it with another piece, thus here black can play queen moves to g2, check. Requiring king takes queen. Since this involved sacrificing a queen, you seek mate as a payoff. Black wants to move his rook where it can add to the pressure on white's king, now on g2, that will be created by the unmasked bishop on b7. The rook can go two places to do this, both involving a capture, rook takes at f2 and rook takes at g3. The move to f2 is unproductive since white just replies king takes rook. Rook takes at g3, however, is checkmate. It is double check, so capturing the rook with a pawn does not help white. Meanwhile the rook has protection against white's king from the other black bishop on d6, and it cuts off the only squares the king could use to escape the diagonal. Black to move. What is the best move? A similar idea. Black has the familiar kernel of a discovery on the long diagonal leading toward white's king. First the king needs to be drawn onto the diagonal. Here as in the last position, the queen can be sacrificed to force the needed result. Queen moves to h1, check. Requiring king takes queen. Now the rook's job again is to both unmask a check and add to the pressure on white's king. This it does with rook takes knight, check. Plus, putting the king in double check and so requiring it to move. Its only flight square is g1. Now black goes in for the kill with rook moves to h1, checkmate. The bishop protects the rook and also cuts off the king's flight square to the north, a classic mating pattern we considered in the chapter on discoveries by the bishop.